Hello and welcome to Trib Talk, a production of the Salt Lake Tribune. I'm Becky Jacobs, a reporter and Report for America Corps member focused on covering women's issues and the status of women in Utah. This afternoon, we're talking about a Wallet Hub ranking released last week that named Utah as the worst state for women's equality for the third year in a row. With me today are Susan Madsen, founder and director of the Utah Women in Leadership Project at Utah State University, and Erin Jemison, former director of public policy at the YWCA Utah. Thank you both for joining.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
We also welcome questions today, which you can submit by using hashtag TribTalk on Twitter or emailing tribtalk@sltrib.com or commenting on Facebook, but we'll jump right into it. I spoke with both you, Susan, and Erin last week for the story about the ranking. You both had the same reaction that a lot of readers had, it was not surprising, but disappointing to be ranked the worst for women's equality for a third consecutive year. So my first general question is it okay that Utah has had this label for 3 years? And what should Utahns take away from this ranking?
So I would first say that actually the rankings that I've been watching are from the last 10 years, not just Wallet Hub, but other ones as well. And they've been pretty consistent over the years. So that's why I'm not surprised. But in the question that you just asked, is that okay or whatever? No, it's not okay. And we're working so hard, many of us in the state, including you, both of you, working so hard on this issue. So it is disappointing that we're not starting to see that needle move a little bit.
Yeah, and I would add to that I think these different rankings often have us pretty low. I think one of the things I like to point out is that when you look at some of the state-by-state comparisons, Utah women do better when it comes to health outcomes. There are still plenty of areas of improvement, but I think, when we rank last or close to last, that's when we hear about them more. But there are some areas where women and girls in Utah are doing better, and that's not to minimize the need to address some of these other areas. But it does tend to be in these economic and leadership areas where, again, like Susan just said, a lot of us are doing a lot of work on it because there's improvement that is needed. And sometimes it's just baby steps forward. I think there's a lot changing, but we still have work to do.
Well, going off what Erin said, this report highlighted some gaps that the two of you and I have talked about. There's political representation, the gender wage gap, educational attainment, work hours, women in executive positions. From both of you, where does Utah start to try to address these rankings and change this reputation? I guess, where can we take first steps to start making some movement?
I'll pop in and there are many places that we need to change this. But the one, when I look deeper, Wallet Hub always sends me a little bit deeper information so I know all the subscales and what we're ranking in. It's quite interesting to look at the empowerment or leadership or political area that we get ranked on often. And when we look deeper, it wasn't just the legislature, that's an important one, but they looked at women in Congress. And of course, we don't have any women in Congress, right? So there were some things that actually, if we had one woman elected in a certain position, that would change things. And in the state legislature, which ends up on lots of rankings, just even 1 or 2 or 5 would be even better. All of those numbers. So sometimes it's just 1 or 2 or 3 people that can start changing those. And it's not just, Becky, it's not just about the numbers. It actually matters when those women's voices are there. They can help change things that'll impact thousands in the state, millions in the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a perfect point. Executive office in Utah is another area that for the past, I'm going to say the wrong numbers. I'm not going to say it, but we currently have no women in our statewide executive offices. We will definitely, no matter who wins in November, have a female lieutenant governor. And so that will help us with some of these rankings because, like Susan said, unfortunately, it doesn't take much because I think we need to be really clear that every state struggles in these areas. There isn't a state except maybe I think Nevada finally got to gender parity in their legislature. But every state's dealing with these leadership challenges. And and it doesn't take a lot to shift it. And we actually do have the record number of women serving in the Utah State Legislature right now, and no one would say that we're at parity or that it's enough, but I do think sometimes we need to recognize progress being made so that people can kind of keep the hope alive and keep moving forward.
But like most of these, I do want to push a little bit there, because most of these things that we're talking about in this ranking, you know, generally speaking, all states struggle some, but for most things in Utah, we struggle more.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that Utah's the only one that struggles with the wage gap. What's different is we struggle almost the most with the wage gap or the education. I think one more thing I would like to point out, I mean, the wage gap, I think there's work that we can be done, a couple of bills that hopefully will come up again on not asking for your previous salary, on also the trying to get a study of wage gap in the state government.
Mm-hmm.
But one more thing I'd like to pitch, one more thing we can do is to continue the talk and encouragement that we give to girls and women that college is important, that they should go to college, get those associates, get those bachelors. But this ranking really looked at graduate degrees, and we fall behind on graduate degrees.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're going to come back to wage gap, but I did want to talk to Susan about that when you look at our education, for years now, women and men in the state are earning bachelor's degrees about the same. Like you said, it's graduate degrees where we see kind of a split. As you said, that affects our ranking, but how can we begin to improve and get that a little more equal in Utah?
Well, let me just clarify what you just said. Yes, it is true that in Utah now at the bachelor's degree level, we are equal with women and men, but we're still not going to rank high in the nation because it compares Utah to the nation just for women. And the nation, actually, many states have a lot more women and not, in my opinion, enough men. So what we want is not a lot of more women going and not less men. We want more women and more men. So I just want to clarify that.
Mm-hmm.
And graduate degrees, oh my, there is a culture that really discourages for many women going to graduate. They can accept a bachelor's degree, but why? I have so many women that people say to them, like, why do you need a master's degree? Why do you? So changing that and really just one by one, encouraging girls and women to move forward, I think can make a difference. So we need to keep talking about it and writing about it.
And I think when we really dig into, and Susan was more part of this than I was, but dug into the data around higher education attainment in Utah a couple of years ago for the Women in the Economy Commission. And some of that, again, we can't say that it's caused by this, but some of the correlation with that drop in graduate education and degrees really coincides with getting married and starting to have children and some of those kind of traditional gender roles that start to come into play. And I always harken back to that, Becky, you're going to roll your eyes because it's the same thing I always say about the gender wage gap is that until we start to address some of those issues, and that's not to say people shouldn't get married and have children, it's to say, why does getting married and having children automatically become the most detrimental to the woman in the relationship? And how do we get past what obviously are some kind of basic biology reasons for that and recognize that it goes far beyond that 9 months or first few years of the child's life? Like what is that barrier, and how do we start to talk to each other about what some of those pressures are and where we can make some movement?
And one of those I've written about and talked about before is I found in 2 different studies through the years that we have such a strong concept of women that in the either or versus the and.
Exactly.
And so we really say, okay, I'm good. College is the most important thing. Then I get married or I have that first baby. And then it's not and anymore. It's like, oh, I have to. So there's this mentality. Now I have to give up. You know, I'm having this baby. Now I have to give up college. And we've still found in other things, even with leadership, if I'm a mother, these perceptions of I can't be a leader. I can only be a mother, not a leader.
Mm-hmm.
I can only be a mother, not run for office, and so forth. So that, I think, trips us up here in the state.
And those pressures come up when we talk about the gender wage gap and what's expected and who takes the burdens. There are different measurements, but in Utah, we generally, it's about 70%. Women in Utah make about 70 cents per dollar compared to women nationally, where they're about 80 cents. It grows when you look at women of color. Erin and I talked last week. There was this report that came out from the Utah's advisory committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and they specifically looked at our wage gap. Some of the recommendations they made for the state legislature to address are some Susan brought up: prohibiting employers from asking about salary history, raising the minimum wage, provide mandatory paid paternal leave. Erin, when we were talking, you mentioned Utah is probably about 10 years behind these recommendations. We're not quite ready for them yet. I guess, what will it take for Utah to get ready for that? And are these steps that we do need to eventually take? And Susan, jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I think the reason I say we're 10 years behind is because I think what we as policy advocates continue to run into with some of these bills is around regulating or mandating private business to do anything. So when it comes to asking about previous salaries, we know that's a really concrete, discrete, really pretty simple policy change that we could make that could affect the wage gap. We know that when you put your previous salary on there, it could impact what the next job offers you. And HR professionals right and left will tell you that that should not be the case and that jobs should be paid what they're worth, period. But what legislators say over and over is that's an HR best practice. HR departments across individual companies should deal with that. That's not something that's the legislature's business to mandate. And I think that's what we continually run up against with these issues. And so then we kind of transition to the bill that Senator Escamilla has been working on for many years to try to at least get some data on state agencies, because that is the business of the state legislature. I mean, the executive branch and what they're doing when it comes to people's salary should be something the legislature looks into. And then they continually have roadblocked that, even when it's been a pretty cheap proposition that she has made, or it's not like it would take a lot of state dollars to get some of that data and start to look at that. I think there's a fear that it will kind of support what they see as gender or as identity politics rhetoric, that people should be paid fairly, period. Why do we need to look at gender in particular? And I think that's where we have a lot of education still to do. And it takes one-on-one individual relationship building with legislators to kind of break down that defensiveness and talk about the fact that, of course, we believe all people should be paid fairly. We want to look at this because we know that gender is one area where some of that unfairness can creep in. We know that it can happen with race and other factors as well. That's why we need to look at this. It's not to say that we are only basing it on those factors, but that's where we're seeing the issues. And let's just make sure that state agencies have the resources they need to make sure they're paying people fairly. And we just haven't gotten through on that conversation yet, but I think it does take some of that relationship building and one-on-one conversations around that.
And a couple thoughts on this. One thing that I've noticed, and Erin's been up at the legislature a lot more than I, but I've been in conversations around the state. And one thing I've noticed is we really do have a mentality, sometimes women, but men a lot more than women, of the zero-sum mentality. And that means there's this defensiveness that if we help raise the salaries or raise women or girls in some way, it's going to have to take away from somebody else. And so when men specifically, we have a lot of white men in the legislature, they're the privileged group, and the research supports that, of course. And so when we have the mentality that if we do something here, it's going to take, then we're going to be fighting and we're not going to be moving forward. What the research is quite clear about is there are ways, there are strategies to lift girls and women and other kinds of diversity as well, and also continue to lift men and families and communities all at the same time. So that zero-sum game I see really influences many things. And then the one other thing I wanted to say about this topic was, when I talk about the gender wage gap, I really talk about two areas, and that is sometimes the internal challenges that women have, and then the external, the systems and processes in place. And oftentimes when I hear about the discussions in Utah, there's more, and there are struggles with women negotiated and so forth. But even with those, when women negotiate, there's norms, social norms that they beat up against. But many people kind of blame the women for all the issues and say, well, it's their choice, those things. But when you look, it's just, what I'm saying is it's quite complex. And even if there's been socialization for years about that, that doesn't mean it's women's issue. It's all of our issues to affect all of our families. We need to work on both. That's what I'm saying.
There's a lot that has to be moving at one time whenever we touch on one of these topics. I did ask the Tribune's Women in Utah Facebook group yesterday if anyone had questions for our Trib Talk today. Christine asked, how important is the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment to Utah, and what effect do you think that will have on achieving equality? I think she's curious about whether that could play a role in changing our rankings. Do either of you have thoughts on that?
I think Erin's probably followed it more. I'm in so many different topics that I'm trying to keep up with where everything is right now.
Yeah, I know the YWCA, when I was there, and a lot of other organizations that I really respect and follow, all endorse and support that ratification. This is where you're going to get my personal opinion outside of that role, is that I don't think there's going to be a magic light switch that happens when that's ratified. I think the issues that we are running up against are much more deep-seated around some of those cultural norms. And again, I don't think it's always specific to Utah, even though we seem to struggle more. I think those especially when we're talking about the gender wage gap and even the leadership issues, that work-family balance, that other parts of life that women are still expected to do most of the work around, quite frankly, and whether that's socialized, whether that's in families and cultures, whether there's some kind of natural predilection towards that, I think we could debate about that forever. But the reality is that when I hear what those barriers are, they're really about those expectations and those other things that are just plain taking up women's time, labor, emotional energy, physical energy. I mean, I just don't think we can ever get around that when you look at why women might not be running for office, why they might not be putting in for that promotion, why they're struggling with wage parity with their peers. You just can't get away from those other pieces of life that women are still taking more responsibility for. And many people think that that's the way it should be. And that's one of the conversations that needs to happen in order to get through it. So I don't personally think that the ERA is going to magically flip the switch. I don't think that means we shouldn't do it. I think that it's pretty ridiculous that equality isn't guaranteed in our Constitution. But I think there's some deeper seated issues here that no single law or even Constitution change can get us through.
And I would just comment, I love what Erin said, and I agree with her wholeheartedly on that. That really, public policy is one element, element, but it's just one element, and we need to do that. But we also need to be doing things like educating men and educating girls and boys and educating women and doing all of these other things kind of at the same time, because organizations and government leaders, control many elements or cultural things or decisions that impact this and many other issues as well. Mm-hmm. The wage gap and there's so many issues, unpaid care work and childcare and just look on our website and you'll see how they're all there. And so it takes a lot more people than Erin and I and other great people that have been in this conversation. It really, to get down to the individual level change, it takes all of us to start those conversations. So it's a lot of work to be done, but I'm optimistic.
And Susan, going off of that, what are some questions that individuals can ask themselves to really start thinking about how this impacts their life and what role they can play in making changes to improve the lives of women in Utah?
So I think the first question I would always is how aware are you of the issues? I'm really, the more I've gone forward, the more I understand how if we don't understand unconscious bias and our own unconscious bias, let alone navigating unconscious bias around us, that we just don't see what we can actually see. I see now that I've been working on it, I'm not perfect. I still have a lot of unconscious bias, but I see so much. And so I would say, learn more about unconscious bias, but then read the reports, understand, and not just, news is important, but go a little bit deeper, read what's happening around us. And then there's recommendations in all of those reports. And for women, but men as well, use your voice. Find that voice if you don't have it. Use it. Find, and Erin can talk more about this, find that passion with whether it's a gender issue or other issues where you can use your voice and really influence in different ways, and particularly at the state legislature, I would say.
We did get a question from someone who asked about the connection between some of our reputation in Utah for childhood education, I'm guessing with funding and with how many kids are in classrooms, and if that ties in at all with equality for women. I think we've touched on how multiple topics fold in, but do you see how that would fit into this as well?
This is one of my favorite topics.
Go ahead, Erin.
Because I think the policy conversation up on the Hill gets dominated by a few extreme voices, and I think actually what we found at the YWCA in doing policy work and even traveling, when we could do that, traveling around the state and talking to childcare providers, early childhood educators, and frankly moms and families in general, is that across the political spectrum, people want to be able to choose earlier and more variety of early education for their children. And the minute they're able to do that, that opens up economic opportunities for their family. Whether we like it or not, whether culturally we think it's mainstream or not, women in Utah are working outside of the home, and they're working outside of the home at the same level as other women across the country. They tend to work part-time more. That's where we really see the difference. And when you really start to talk to women about why that is, of course, there are some who that's their preference, their choice. That's great. There are others who say, if I could get my child into public education at kindergarten or at preschool, I would be able to work full time. And that's actually what my family needs to make ends meet and be able to pay the bills. But we don't have enough of those options in Utah that are publicly funded. So I think not only does it affect women's equality, it affects families' economic stability, frankly. And I think that we still get stuck in this narrative around women in Utah working outside of the home. And it's just not true. And I think we would see even more of it because families need the extra income if we could find ways to better fund all-day kindergarten across the state. We passed it last session. It wasn't for everyone, but it increased it. Then it got cut with COVID. Now it's supposed to be getting funded again. But that's an issue where I think doesn't always make the headlines. Nobody's like, yay, optional all-day kindergarten, and what funding did it get? But legislators and advocates are working really hard on those issues, and I think that will impact women's equality, that will impact the gender wage gap, and it will also make families more economically stable down the road. And we need to look at some of those issues that might not be as exciting to talk about, but really do impact people's day-to-day lives.
And Erin, I have to say, first of all, I know you're committed because you were tapping your finger on the desk.
Nonverbals.
Also, I just wanted to add that it really does benefit the child.
Right, sorry, I always forget that part. Yeah, it's true.
There's so much research and evidence that learning, even as a baby, starting to read all the way up, how much, those young minds, and I'm talking babies, can benefit from all of those things. So, yeah, you missed the most important thing, Erin.
I know. My colleagues at Voices for Utah Children are always joking that if we spend half as much time talking about preschool as we do about college, it actually is the more important years, those early years. And yes, I always joke, like, I'm always looking out for the women. They've got the children. Thanks for bringing it around, Susan.
And I think it's going to be interesting seeing those discussions as people continue to work from home, and we're seeing the need for more of it too, especially with the need for childcare. it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
And Becky, just real quick, even in our language with COVID and the pandemic, because Erin used, I'm picking on you, Erin. Erin worked outside the home, but we're all working in the home now. So just even the language, but I paid work, so she works, have paid work or unpaid work, you know.
Yeah.
Women always work, no matter what.
Yeah, and early studies are already showing the pandemic is impacting the gender equality in a negative way. That the people having to quit jobs because of being home or just not being able to do as much of their job because of those other responsibilities. Again, we're seeing it more with women.
Yeah, and did you know, there was a study last week, I think, that came out that said actually men are getting more promotions during this time.
Really?
I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, and women are not. And so I did a radio show last week really talking about how we move into these patterns of men compartmentalizing even when they're at home. And women, we just don't have that luxury. We integrate more things. And that impacts the issues we're talking about today, Becky.
We're getting some questions about kind of culture. There is the dominant religion in Utah. There's also kind of traditional family values. When we did a poll of Utah women across the state last year with the Salt Lake Tribune, they identified their top 2 challenges as low wages and cultural expectations about gender roles. You both touched on this earlier, but I guess how do those cultural norms and expectations play into addressing these issues as well?
They really do. Erin, you want to start?
I'll just say really quick, one of the ways that I saw this play out right in front of my eyes was at the legislative session this year in 2020. There was a bill for state agencies to have more paid parental leave, and it was gender neutral. And again, it was very much in the realm of what the legislature should be looking at, which is state agencies, the executive branch, the governor's office, very supportive. It was actually the governor's office came and testified on the bill. All the benefits to kids and workers and the state in general if we did more paid parental leave. And the bill made it through all the various hearings. And when it got down to having to fund it, because there was obviously a fiscal note there for the state, when it came down to it, they ended up cutting everything except a few weeks for, I think they called it postpartum leave. So it was very much just for women and just for women biologically having the child. It was very focused on those few weeks right afterwards when people have to be home from their job and the state will now pay them. And I think it was just such a clear example of us trying to expand people's minds around what people need in that workplace and when they're new parents. And yet we kind of landed back in that, well, at least we can do this for the ladies for those first few weeks after they biologically have a child. So I just think it was kind of a combo of those 2 issues really coming to a head in policy.
Yeah, and I would just say I've been looking at and really studying and focusing on research related not necessarily to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but to all religions. And it is very clear that in states and in countries, 2 different studies, in more religious states across the United States, there is more of a wage gap. In more religious countries across the world, there is more of a wage gap. In more other studies say in more conservative societies, whatever religion, whatever we're doing, there are more disadvantages, for women. So there's some interesting things that I think we need to wrestle with in terms of conservatism and religious societies that generally have disadvantaged women in many ways, whether it's intentional or not. But once people have power, they want to keep it. I'm just putting it out there.
Ooh, with a zinger at the end, Susan. I like it.
Well, we're coming up on the last 30 seconds. Is there anything I didn't ask that you think we should touch on? If anyone wants to type in a last question.
I would love to just say our website, I've moved up to Utah State University recently with the Utah Women in Leadership Project. And if you're interested in deeper research, utwomen.org, you can find any research on many of all these topics and others?
I go there all the time.
Yeah, it's a great, it really shows like all the different factors that we're talking about. I love that website. And I think if you're interested in other organizations that are really looking at these issues combined with looking at racism's impact, we didn't talk a lot about that today. I would encourage you to look at YWCAUtah.org, but other organizations in our state are advocating for change that really looks at how both race and gender impact folks as well. So appreciate the opportunity to talk about this stuff. It's needed.
Well, thank you again, and thank you for everyone for watching Trib Talk. You can keep up with the latest stories in our next Trib Talk at sltrib.com. And thank you both.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye-bye.